Welcome back, everyone, to our series on the Kochs. Unfortunately, I think it's now time to talk about the political stuff. We're going to do our best to tackle this in a linear manner and make it flow like some sort of story, but it won't be easy. If we do this right, we'll convey a handful of claimed overarching beliefs held by the Kochs. We'll explore how those beliefs came to be held by the Kochs, how the Kochs have advocated for those beliefs, and the results of that advocacy. So let's kick things off how we must. By trying to structure this episode like a book. And, the theme song. Shit.
Chapter 1, Fred Koch.
So Fred's an interesting character to study. We don't have evidence to support this, but given his circumstances and the time and place in which he lived, one can theorize that Fred Koch was always conservative relative to modern definitions of the phrase. But by the time Fred was a successful adult, by our standards or the fucked up backwoods standards of yore, his politics were wild.
Bananas.
Crazy.
Just bananas.
Yeah. The cause of this ideological shift seems to be his time in Soviet Russia, where a few associates of Fred's were killed by the Russians, and his handler, which he calls this guy's handler, a Mr. Jeremy Lifshitz, who may or may not have been aware of these killings, just carted him around a Stalin-controlled Russia, telling him all the while that communists were going to be launching a massive campaign to infiltrate the U.S. by first gaining control of the country's schools, universities, churches, labor unions, government, and armed forces. And Fred apparently quoted this next line directly from Lifshitz's mouth. "We're going to make you rotten to the core." And I don't know if Lifshitz was just fucking with Fred here or trying to make light of his war-torn surroundings. Apparently at one point, Fred and someone else pulled him out from under a flipped car, and he was like, "Why'd you do that? I'm basically your fucking enemy."
Which is such a bananas turn of events.
To treat your own life with that much of a cavalier attitude, where you're like refusing to acknowledge human nature or any humanity in this situation and just being like, we're at war, man. Like, if I die, that's a win for you.
Don't save me.
Yeah.
But like, if we're taking a step back, one of a couple things is happening here.
Mm-hmm.
Number one. Now, remember, all of what we're describing comes from a book written by Fred. And it is entirely possible or probable that Fred is embellishing a good bit here for narrative color.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about pamphlets that these people fucking release. And we are going to be using the word pamphlet and book interchangeably, by the way, because this was a 30-page pamphlet.
Yes.
That is a book.
Yeah, that is blurring the lines, for sure.
Fred needed to move some fucking books. So we don't think it's out of the question that he might have embellished this here and there as necessary.
Right. And no one who believes that communism is good would describe it as plaguing a host civilization this way. Like, make you rotten to the core.
There's never been a powerful coalition of people who overtly just wanted to be evil and do cartoonishly bad things.
No bad guys ever thought they were the bad guys, for sure. So, another possibility of this whole scenario is Lifshitz is making light of a tough situation and is just kind of fucking with it. Which is better and more lighthearted in my mind. And some of our listeners might be thinking, well, what if there were attempts by the communists to infiltrate American politics, and Fred kind of was on to something? And I don't want to get too sidetracked by exploring the past century of American foreign policy or analyze relations between Russia and the U.S., because that's not what this episode is about. But we can confidently say that what Lifshitz was saying has really never been empirically supported. And while there have been campaigns in the U.S. to identify communists, no broad subversive plots like the one that Lifshitz was describing have been uncovered, especially around this time. Because you got to remember, this was like the 20s.
Yeah.
He was most likely just trying to scare the living shits out of Fred. And
Yeah.
though
A
I
silly
did
Kansas
read,
farmer man.
yeah, and I did read this thing on Reddit the other day though about the FBI agent. His name was Robert Hassan, who was tasked with finding a mole in the FBI from the KGB, and it turned out that he had been the mole for years. Just truly hilarious displays of incompetence. But again, that scenario was described as like the worst American intelligence disaster ever and wasn't very widespread at all.
It's straight out of the movie The Departed or
You mean The Departed.
The Departed. Yeah, that's what I mean, I guess. Also, another little piece of context here. As much as anyone loves a good villain origin story, it's pretty important to note that paranoid anti-communist sentiments weren't exactly unique to our farm boy here. You see, there have been several periods of anti-communist hysteria in the U.S. since before the outbreak of World War I. So when Fred came back from Russia spewing anti-communist rhetoric, there was already an ever-growing group of people who were just terrified about the Bolsheviks stealing all of America's freedom. Nonetheless, Fred came back from Russia a changed man. What was surely a traditional conservative upbringing seemingly gave way to paranoid anti-communist sentiments. According to our pal Fred, communism was already everywhere, waiting to take over America through a lethal combination of general strikes, race riots, foreign aid, and world government? As far as Fred was concerned, Lifshitz was successful. Communism had already infiltrated schools, universities, labor unions, and the government. As such, Fred, very conveniently for his business interests as well, fought and lobbied for a right-to-work law, which was enshrined in the Kansas State Constitution in 1958. And after McCarthyism began falling to the wayside, Fred joined forces with Robert Welsh, a Ben Shapiro-type character of yesteryear, to create the John Birch Society, which we've mentioned in a past episode. Basically, this was a group of people who were sad to see the second Red Scare come to an end. The John Birch Society took bold stances across the right side of the political spectrum. They actually opposed the Vietnam War and disliked Dwight Eisenhower, favoring isolationism instead of involvement in outside wars, and accusing Dwight Eisenhower of being a secret communist. The first part of that statement is almost commendable. We're going to run into this.
But
Now, the John Birch Society's stance on racism and what they did to advance a racist cause is telling. They launched the Support Your Local Police movement and passed out bumper stickers saying the same. They amplified and circulated conspiracies that pictures of African American protesters getting attacked by dogs were staged. They lobbied for the impeachment of Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren after Warren voted yes to school integration. And they promoted a pamphlet in quotations, called It's Very Simple, which, over the course of God knows how many pages, detailed the reality of Martin Luther King's plot. He wasn't a reverend fighting for equality, you see. He was secretly a communist, with a shadowy agenda to strong-arm Congress into installing more collectivism. Very simple indeed.
Dude, when you talk about this shit, like, it's just so evident that history fucking repeats itself.
God,
like,
right?
You could scratch out the John Birch Society and put how many right-wing efforts in the John Birch Society's place today. You know, like the very poorly veiled racism, the hysteria around collectivism and socialism and communism. Like, it's so funny when you realize that while these ideas are fucking outlandish and wrong, obviously, if you talk to someone between the ages of, let's say, 45 and 80, and you mention the word communism or socialism or collectivism, you can see the visceral, angry response that those terms generate. And nowadays, fucking Fox News and all of those other right-wing platforms will just throw those buzzwords in to trigger that demographic of people. We hate how funny this is to look at, but I hate more how much it kind of fucking worked.
How much it kind of works, and just how, okay, I generally object to the idea there's no such thing as original ideas. I've told you all sorts of my brilliant invention ideas.
All of my ideas are original. Fuck off.
No one has ever come to me with the idea of food book or the 3-person horse costume. But
I have had to listen to those ideas in painful detail.
You've listened to my entire business model for those brilliant ideas. This stuff is as old as time. All of this stuff. And when you see one of these things circulate Fox News or circulate the Twitter sphere, I'm never calling it X.
Nope. Suck a dick, Elon Musk.
Right? All of this stuff is ages old. None of these ideas for attacking a progressive movement are off the dome or off the cuff. People have been doing this, trying to derail these movements for decades.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. And underneath all of their articulated motivations is always the same bigoted bullshit.
That's it.
But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, you're good. Tangent completed. Tangent completed. They also advocated for nullification, which was the belief that states should ignore federally mandated efforts to integrate schools. And after a series of pretty key defeats, they would go on to oppose the equal rights movement of the 70s, which fought to protect women from sexual discrimination. Keep in mind, by the way, when folks like this lose, they just move to the next thing like clockwork. You'll see it again and again.
They cut their losses very well.
Yep, that's it. I alluded to this way back in our first episode when we mentioned the John Birch Society, but they are just such a good illustration of radical reactionaries creating these artificial boogeymen and then wielding them as an excuse to take others' rights and support their own positions. They love to sow dissent and feed wild conspiracy theories to take credibility away from everyone who doesn't blindly adhere to whatever values personally enrich them. And that's another big takeaway here. Coincidentally, a lot of these policies enrich a select few.
Oh, yeah.
That is not coincidence. That's the main thing. That's the feature. Fred, however, wouldn't be taking part in the John Birch Society's efforts to oppose the equal rights movement for much longer. Fred had more important things to get to, namely dying, which he finally did in 1967. Charles would take his place at the helm of the company in 1968 and would separate from the John Birch Society for a pretty fascinating reason that very same year.
Chapter 2. Charles and David Koch.
And it wasn't the racism. Charles had been present for a lot of that and never seemed to take issue. Yeah, it was because Robert Welsh began supporting the Vietnam War. Apparently a line in the sand for Charles. This is just an aside. They're like,
a lot of those.
Dwight Eisenhower sucks, and the Vietnam War is bad. And I'm like, God damn. Trying to separate my opinion on the Vietnam War from Charles Koch's opinion is an extremely frustrating exercise. We agree on a lot of stuff just for completely different reasons. Also, it is time to throw Charlie Boy a bone. Turns out he wasn't so sure, after all, that Dwight Eisenhower was indeed a communist.
Now, before we accuse Charles of experiencing some sort of character development, we need to understand why he didn't support the war. It had nothing to do with young men dying or war is hell, but it was really because Charles was an isolationist, and he wanted to avoid contact with other nations. Cue Alex Jones ranting about the globalists or whatever.
Yeah, that's it. It's more of that racism stuff. It's crazy. So, despite the pleas of Robert Welsh, the head dude at the John Birch Society who we talked about earlier, Charles was gone. And although there's narrative that he tries to imply, this didn't mean Charles was finished with politics.
Correct. Turns out Charles just wanted a different outlet for his radical ideas. And years before, he found some relief through the Freedom School, which was run by a gentleman named Robert Lefebvre, which has extra letters because it's French. For anyone wondering, Robert Lefebvre was offering grants for segregation academies, which were schools in which segregation still existed. So Charles wasn't running away from the John Birch societies due to racism. He was running toward racism, but like for different reasons.
Yeah.
Robert Lefebvre was a member of the I Am movement, which was and still does appear to be kind of a cult. So interesting. We got our information for this from an article which Brian Doherty chronicled the rise of American libertarianism in his book Radicals for Capitalism. And he described Robert Lefebvre's school as, quote, a tiny world of people who thought the New Deal was a horrible mistake. The school taught a revisionist version of American history in which the robber barons were heroes. The Gilded Age was actually the country's golden age, and the Civil War shouldn't have been fought. In 1965, the New York Times described the school as so implacably opposed to the U.S. government, it was proposing that the Constitution be scrapped in favor of one that limited the government's authority to impose compulsory taxation.
Basically, Homie was in one of the most conservative societies in the U.S. and was like, it's not fiscally conservative enough, but, let's keep the racism somehow.
Chapter 3. An Intro to Politics.
Okay. So we've talked a little about what Charles and David believe, or what they express they believe to the general public, which is surely rooted in the very normal upbringing that we described in episode 1. Check it out. However, we need to jump to episode 2, a quick flashback, and really pin down where these beliefs transitioned into something that Charles and David felt the urge to evangelize to the rest of the United States, and arguably send the U.S. down the path that it's on today. You may remember the story of Charles getting targeted by that congressional committee, and Mr. Ken Bowlen really being out for blood. I don't think we need to rehash our entire story here, but if you're choosing to skip that episode, or you just want to jump into this one, here are the cliff notes. A congressional committee forms to investigate American oil companies stealing oil from Native Americans. They target the Kochs because the Kochs seem to be low-hanging fruit.
They're just really bad at covering their tracks.
They're the worst at that shit. FBI agent Jim Elroy catches them in the act, and then politics ensue. Now, we mentioned in our last episode how this is what first incentivized the Kochs to become heavily involved in politics, and this is mostly true. Unfortunately, though, very few stories are completely cut and dry. There is no on and off switch. It's always a fader. David had been on the Libertarian ticket as VP in 1980 and had been heavily involved in the Nixon campaign, but up until this point, it was pretty standard, politically opinionated, rich guy shit. It's the stuff we'd all heard before.
Yeah.
However, with the fuzz on his ass, Charles was standing down the barrel of a pretty gnarly jail sentence, so they used their engineering brains to work out how to subversively influence public policy to make the whole thing go away. What we didn't mention is that in addition to investing in the political machine that we're going to spend the majority of this episode talking about, the Kochs also jumped into just good old-fashioned intimidation. During the long judicial proceedings, Jim Elroy reported that he was being followed. Now, at first glance, this might sound like some run-of-the-mill law enforcement paranoia. There's plenty of that, particularly in this time. But Jim used his G-Man training to corner and confront his alleged stalker, and the guy just fessed up to working for the Kochs. He caught a PI in the act.
You don't think that this happens in real life, FBI agents being followed by shadowy PIs working for billionaires. But it fucking did, dude.
It's real life. And also, it's a nice reminder of how nerdy and pathetic PIs are, really. The movies really carve them out to be kind of badass dudes who never give up their source, but there's a lot of training on just fessing up if you get caught.
Exactly.
Yeah. Unfortunately for Jim, though, and the American people, at some point down the road, Jim would quit the case for, quote, personal reasons, and regret it years later, saying it was really selfish. I should have stayed and finished this job. He also added, I know if I had stayed that Charles and David would be in jail now. We weren't able to find any more on why he quit or if intimidation had anything to do with it, but it's still an unfortunate result for sure. Well, this case was unfolding. Charles and David Koch must have realized that they both had a kink for disrupting American democracy, because this is really where the gears start turning. Like we said before, the Native American oil case is where they started laying the groundwork for what would become a sprawling network of think tanks, nonprofits, donor hubs, all that fun stuff. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. We're still in the late 80s, and the Kochs are still laughing maniacally as they summon their flying monkeys. Not really, but they were starting to gather some pretty important resources. A little under 20 years earlier, Charles had met an economist at Rutgers University named Richard Fink. Fink had founded the Mercatus Center at Rutgers in 1980. We're probably mispronouncing that. We don't give a shit on this one. With support from the Kochs. And in 1989, he came on board as an executive VP for Koch Industries. Old Dickie Fink is going to be absolutely essential for the Koch bros' many dastardly deeds in the coming years. For right now, he's helping them write the playbook to take over the world. I'm slightly exaggerating, but only very slightly. And I think Jane Meyer, in her seminal piece on the Kochs, words it as change American politics, or something a little less inflammatory. Basically, Fink boils down changing American politics to 3 steps.
1, subsidize think tanks. 2, market ideas through political groups to agitate for them. And 3, build pressure on politicians.
To sort of go into how this is different from what was happening before candidates would come and appeal to groups like Koch Industries. That's always been in politics. The politicians come to them and they go, hey, we can do this for you if we have your vote. What the Kochs are now trying to do is tell the politicians what they want beforehand. They write the narrative, and politicians who want their vote pick up on these policies.
Well, and when they're marketing ideas through political groups to agitate, what they're doing effectively is trying to make it seem like these ideas aren't coming from them. You market your idea through whatever means, and then you put it in the mouths of normal people. The people demonstrate and cry out, and the politicians, while they might know where the ideas are really coming from, the way that it's reported and the way that it looks is much more a grassroots initiative. And we'll get more into that.
Yeah, for sure. We in the biz call this astroturfing.
Yes.
We'll get into that more. Additionally, for all of this to work, you need to apply it on both the state and federal levels. And that's what they did. The Kochtopus, as they call it, was born. Which I hate that name. It sounds too cool for what they're doing.
It's so Bond villainy.
Yeah. Why do they get to be Bond villains? Jesus.
Yeah.
It's important to note here that not all of these ideas were original. Both Fink and the Kochs borrowed heavily from Robert Mellenskaith, another billionaire conservative philanthropist who wrote a manifesto in the 70s about how to influence democracy.
Yeah, this is fucking crazy shit, dude. Like tinfoil hat wearing crazy shit.
And what's funny is how often conspiracy theorists and the tinfoil hat wearing community just looks at all of this and goes, yeah.
This is fine.
When journalists describe the Kochtopus, they're describing a complex web of the things we listed. Conservative think tanks, political action groups, dark money pools, lots of shady shit. Unfortunately, for simple-minded podcasters like yours truly, because there are so many moving parts in this wicked political machine, it's going to be near impossible to keep our story linear. There are just too many different parts doing different things concurrently that a coherent timeline it gets lost in the fray. So to combat that, we're going to try to tell a series of isolated little stories now about some of the more important cogs in the Koch political machine and what they've been up to for the past few decades. Hopefully, this will help paint a picture of how all of this has been affecting you, our lovely listeners, whether you've known it or not.
Chapter 5, the money. I think that the foundation of the fuckery of the Koch brothers has to be the money. Oh, yeah. Without the money, nothing else really works. No geniuses want to work the think tanks, no politicians can be swayed, no PACs can be taking any political action without money. None of you beautiful people listening are picking your jaws off the floor in response to the suggestion that money has an effect on politics, but the transformation that the Kochs brought about is truly extraordinary.
Yeah, our sources tell us, and keep in mind, we are not that old, but we hear that once upon a time, chatter about candidates was kind of topical. This
Yeah.
was 30 years ago, but when George Bush Sr. failed to secure a second term, the public didn't check in on him until he was fucking dead. Election years were a shitty carnival that would roll into town, put American flags everywhere, offer you stickers or buttons, tell you to vote for someone, sink all their money into ads calling the other candidate a rapist, and then pack up and leave.
Yeah.
In his pursuit of being able to do whatever the fuck he wanted, though, Charles opened a Pandora's box, and now suddenly the shitty carnival was a theme park. All the TV ad money was building infrastructure, and all the folks waiting around to pass out George H. stickers were building homes.
100%. So, in the words of a talk show host that I'm too lazy to Google, show me the money!
Show me the money! In the words of a TV host, quoted by a movie character, quoted by another movie character, and we don't want to Google any of them. Show me the money!
But Charles or David would probably say no, because the whole point of the network is to hide donor money, but I keep getting ahead of myself. Unfortunately, our audio-only medium really isn't the best for this discussion, simply because in order for me to walk everyone through this spider web that is the Koch donation network, I need some sort of diagram.
Yes, perhaps a corkboard, some thumbtacks, and yarn would do the trick.
Yeah. And because it's something that you have to see to believe, and candidly, after seeing a diagram or two, I still don't fully understand what the fuck is happening. But
Yeah, right.
Here is what you need to know. There is an absolute fuckload of money moving around.
Yeah, keep in mind, this is a small portion of what is circulating, but one of our sources was able to surmise the following for a little perspective. Between 1998 and 2008, between the Charles G. Koch Foundation, the Claude R. Lamb Charitable Foundation, which is Charles Koch and his wife Koch's charitable foundation, the David H. Koch Foundation, and Koch Industries, the Kochs gave at least $246 million personally. And these are the donations experts were able to unearth. And the sources of these donations are being intentionally obfuscated anyways. This is the stuff they couldn't cover up. Part of the political agenda of some of these groups is to make it easier to hide this in the future, so we are less certain about how much money is going into it.
Yeah, and what Rad Bill just talked about was the Koch money.
Yeah.
This doesn't include the money that they're able to raise. So let's talk a little bit about the retreats. Before the Kochs can hide money that they want to pump into the political machine, they need to convince people to donate it.
Yep.
And like most things the Kochs do, these retreats are veiled in secrecy. No outsiders are allowed in.
It's grassroots, so that plays.
That shouldn't be as funny to me as it is. But the donations are performed auction style, and the bids increase in increments of $1 million. Now, I found that $1 million figure somewhere, and I can't locate it, so it might be a little more or a little less than $1 million, but bottom line, they're huge, huge donations. And this isn't suggested by any of our sources, but I think that the tight security and the insistence on secrecy actually helps them raise more money.
Yep.
I'm sure the people that are invited to these retreats and these seminars feel much more in the quote-unquote inner circle than if they were just standing on a street corner taking dollars from strangers.
True. And I think the other thing that helps on the secrecy side is that the benefits to these corporate conglomerates, these massive companies, feel a whole lot more incidental if you don't know that the funding dollars are coming directly from them.
Precisely. While the Kochs network is great at hiding where the money comes from, and it raises the money in a really culty way, what I think is most important to our story, once again, is how much money there is. We mentioned this a little bit in episode 1, but in 2016, one of the largest Democratic donors, Democracy Alliance, raised $40 million for the election. The Koch network raised $800 million. It was
Yeah.
double what the Republican National Committee raised. I've seen this mentioned in articles where the author will refer to the Kochtopus as the, quote, third American political party, simply because they have such an incredibly vast war chest. Furthermore, they're really good at investing this money to deliberately bring about or prevent political change. Also, fun little note here, that $800 million in 2016, none of it was donated to Donald Trump's campaign. Without going on a politically charged diatribe, I think that it's important that we mention this disconnect simply because Donald Trump's name gets associated with pretty much everything on the right side of the aisle these days. But the Koch's libertarian ideas really don't jive with a lot of the Donald's policies. And I think it's funny to imagine that somehow the Kochs were gatekeeping Republicans from electing someone like Trump and were simultaneously ruining everything for everyone in the process.
Yeah, it's funny. You can lead a cow to water, but you can't really stop the cow if it starts drinking milk out of its own udder. You're like, fuck
yeah.
me. Why did I shit? You were supposed to drink the water. I put it right in front of you. Why are you sucking on your own udder?
Yeah, sometimes narratives just aren't clean enough. Chapter 6. What does the money do?
It's worth remembering. The money that a large organization doesn't pay in taxes will often just go straight to the bureaucratic, barely legal equivalent of paying bribes.
For sure. Because all of their foundations, are set up as nonprofits. What I think actually impacts us as everyday folks are the causes that this money supports. Now, for this next section, we are actively resisting the urge to do a montage or a little musical
wanted to
number.
do a montage. Oh, God.
Brad Bill loves a good montage.
I love a good montage. I have all these shitty rhymes next to my invention ideas and my notes.
It would have been an efficient way to talk about what these bastards have been doing for the past 4 decades, because there are so many points to cover, but the whole mile wide and an inch deep approach just really doesn't cut it here. Mm-hmm. So we're going to tell a few stories and then make some broad strokes about Charles's political ambitions. But keep in mind while we tell these stories that this list is so incredibly far from comprehensive. Here goes. Our first story opens in Washington, D.C. on January 20th, 2009. Barack Obama has just been sworn in as the first black president of the United States, and there is a euphoria in the air that is palpable. I wasn't old enough to vote back then, but I remember watching Obama in the debates and listening to his confidence and his eloquent speeches and just really feeling a hope that I'm not sure that I'd felt exude in a politician before.
Yeah, this was a funny period. Basically, I just parroted what my parents said, which means I was a dorky child sporting the politics of a 45-year-old Republican adult.
So, Obama takes office, and a lot of white people start getting really pissed off about it.
And a young Rat Bill as well, for reasons he couldn't explain. Yeah.
Yeah, because he was young and listening to his parents, which we all have to stop doing at some point. Those of us who were around at this point might remember there was the birth certificate scandal, lots of really poorly veiled racism on Fox News, and shitty rhetoric from this kind of new group of weird right-wingers who called themselves the Tea Party, whom were heavily funded by one of the Koch's largest political action groups, Americans for Prosperity.
Technically, there's a lineage we have to follow here. The Consumers for a Sound Economy started the Tea Party in 2002, but it was super fringe and very, very, very corporate focused. It hadn't really penetrated either political party or any policy making. 2 years later, the CSE forked into 2 smaller movements, Freedom Works and Americans for Prosperity. Both of these movements were heavily involved in scaling the Tea Party leading into 2009. And to kind of put a bow on this thing, CSE was founded by the Kochs in the 80s. This whole thing was born from them. And although Freedom Works' ultimate separation from CSE was the result of disagreement on political direction, both Freedom Works and Americans for Prosperity are heavily reliant on Koch money.
Dude, they're just playing both sides of the fucking chessboard.
Yeah, it really is hard to exaggerate the Koch's role in creating the Tea Party movement.
100%. And among the angry voices screaming things about, quote, taking our country back, was a young gubernatorial candidate from the wonderful swing state of Wisconsin, Scott Walker. Scott would prove a rising star in the Tea Party due to his disdain for Obama and his aggressive plan to get the state of Wisconsin out of what appeared to be rather dire financial straits. Now, while all this is happening, which is very newsworthy and interesting, there's something else going on that just isn't getting as much national attention. When magicians perform their tricks, they can always be broken into three parts. The pledge, where you're shown some ordinary thing. The turn, where the ordinary thing actually does something kind of cool. And the prestige, where they make the ordinary thing do a crazy thing and everyone's blown away. Now, the Kochs are practiced political magicians. At this point, they've rallied behind Scott Walker, and they're going to help him win. This is the pledge. But while Scott Walker is being groomed by the Kochs to be the next governor of Wisconsin, which will be the turn, another one of their political action groups, Citizens United, is taking a case to the Supreme Court that will alter history: the prestige. On its face, the case is an examination as to whether donors for a political movie demonizing Hillary Clinton need to disclose their contributions to the FEC. But underneath that relatively simple guise is the question, should corporations be protected by the First Amendment like a natural person? This idea raised the eyebrows of even Republican politicians like John McCain, who said, quote, there were certain judges that were alleging that somehow corporations had the same rights as citizens. I don't accept that premise. The certain judges, by the way, included Anthony Scalia and Clarence Thomas, who would get credit for being the deciding vote. Both Clarence and his wife would take Koch money for their respective campaigns, but let's not get too far off track. At the end of these arguments, the court made an extremely broad ruling, which is not what the Supreme Court tends to do, that First Amendment rights extended to corporations. So, if you give a candidate money, it's limited to $2,500. But if you give it to a corporation explicitly supporting that candidate, there's no limit, baby.
And for a second, think about this. This is 2010. We're past the financial crisis, where cases overwhelmed the courts. Of people trying to hold Wall Street accountable for the financial crisis of 2008. And every single judge, every single political body threw their shoulders up, threw their hands up, and said, there's nothing we can do. It was done by corporations, which aren't a person or aren't a chargeable body. You can't charge a corporation with a crime.
You can, but it gets weird and dumb.
Yeah.
So corporations can spend almost unlimited amounts of money to influence American politics. Some of you might be thinking, okay, so I get that, but why is it bad? And I'm going to tell you. Corporations are run by people who are highly incentivized to make decisions based on short-term results. For example, a CEO's annual bonus might be based on how the company's stock did over the past year, or even be granted that company's stock to align their interest with the shareholders. It is in their personal best interest to make that stock price go up at any cost. If you're a CEO of a coal company and someone is pushing for more regulations that will cost you money, you don't give a fuck if it's essential for the safety of the next generation. You just want to make those regulations go away so your line can keep going up.
And I may have mentioned this in a past episode. My memory is really starting to fail me these days.
Same.
There's this feedback loop that's been cited where bad companies make political contributions and increase lobbying efforts to avoid being held accountable for bad behavior. And before long, through this process of donating to cover their own ass, they incidentally become the most powerful forces in government. On this vein, the Koch's political ventures were destined for prominence.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said is thanks to the Kochs.
Yeah.
None of that can happen without this Supreme Court decision. I can't overemphasize how much of a bummer this was for the American people. And again, not to get all tinfoil hatty, it wasn't that interesting to watch it happen. There wasn't as much drama, so it kind of happened without a lot of the American people really knowing. Now, remember, the last two tenets of Richard Fink's plans: market ideas through political groups to agitate and build up pressure on politicians. Through the Citizens United decision, there was no longer a limit in how much corporations could donate to political campaigns or political action groups. So the Kochs would have a growing war chest, and they would use that to build pressure on politicians to convert their harebrained schemes into public policy. Also, remember that these guys aren't just going after the big federal elections. They have to make this work on the state level as well. And with this groundwork set, that's exactly what they did. Between 2009 and 2010, Americans for Prosperity would dispatch Tea Party members in key states to hold rallies where they would call climate change bullshit. In 2009, there was a Tea Party demonstration in Green Bay, Wisconsin that had direct ties to Americans for Prosperity. The air in those rallies was hostile and manic. People held up signs like, "I don't drink the Kool-Aid, I drink tea."
Cool sign, bro.
This was step two. They were marketing their ideas through absolute astroturfing, like textbook astroturfing.
Mm-hmm.
The news coverage would make it look like these ideas were coming from a group of white guys in kooky hats, but they were really just reading from the Koch playbook.
Yeah. That's
By
it.
late 2010, with the donation limits and campaign disclosure laws no longer being worth the paper they were written on, the Kochs are pouring money into Scott Walker's campaign to be governor, becoming the largest donors by a fucking long shot.
Yeah.
Other prominent Republicans are endorsing the guy, and in November, after trouncing his opponent, Scott would get up on the podium and say, "Wisconsin is open for business," which sounds so weirdly sexual. Like, are we whoring
Doesn't
out
it?
Wisconsin? And
It sounds like Scott Walker is uncrossing his legs when he says that.
yeah, which ironically, it's kind of exactly what happened. Step 3 was complete. The
Mhm.
Kochs had put pressure on a political candidate, and Scott Walker was owned by the Kochs and corporate interests.
Ta-da.
Within 2 weeks of taking office, Scott met with a billionaire named Diane Kendricks, who had given scads of money to the Kochs, and there's a video, an actual video, like this isn't hearsay, of Scott laying out his plan to Diane. In the budget adjustment bill, he was going to place an inseparable clause revoking the state labor union's right to collective bargaining, which is negotiating the salaries of the government or the union employees. And the why here is even more sinister than it sounds. See, the Kochs know that the largest Democratic donors are unions. So they know if they can break up the unions, the left will have less funding, and come the 2012 presidential election, the Kochs and the Republicans will have a better chance of winning. And it was either a month or almost a year later, without the state Democrats in the room, this bill passed. Through absolutely diabolical means, the Koch brothers bought Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And then, in 2012, the people tried to fight back. National unions got involved, and over 1 million signatures were filed to recall Walker as governor of Wisconsin. Keep in mind, there are not that many people in Wisconsin.
This isn't a big state. Yeah.
A lot of people really didn't like what Scott Walker was doing. However, the Kochs rushed to the rescue. They dispatched members of Americans' Prosperity to spin the narrative in Walker's favor and pump even more money into his war chest. These motherfuckers even got the John Birch Society to show up and spread lies that Obama was part of a black liberation church and that they saw Marxist fists in the rallies to recall Walker. Again, this is on video. This isn't hearsay.
And by the way, this is a perfect microcosm of how racists are used as a mouthpiece for corporate interests.
Fucking well said. Because in this video, you can see the fear behind these old white people's Coke bottle glasses. And in the end, it would take a lot more money, tens of millions for sure. The effort to recall Walker failed.
Yeah.
And though it, again, took further investment, the Republican special interest groups were able to retain their investment in the American political system. Also, side note here. Why Wisconsin? Wisconsin is a swing state. So the Kochs' decision to get involved in Wisconsin at the beginning was not random. They knew that if they could own Wisconsin, it gave them a better shot at winning the national election. That is a scary story. That is a story of two people through political action groups directly influencing the laws that get passed in a politically important swing state. But you have to understand that that is only the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
This is one of the Koch's numerous efforts to keep their business cheap at the price of your health, your wealth, and your freedom that are all happening kind of at the same time.
This is the core issue with these so-called libertarian ideals, by the way. The way democracy is supposed to work is the majority of the people choose the direction of the state, the country, whatever. What has just happened, surely this money was funneled through charitable foundations, which means it is a tax deduction for the Kochs to do this, is that 1 million people in a state like Wisconsin came together and said, we don't want this person representing us. And then 2 people with money that should have been going to taxes suppressed the preferences of all of those others. Yeah.
A million people who were willing to go out of their way to sign a petition to take action. So not just like 1 million people who you passed in the street, 1 million people who cared enough to do something about it.
These are people trying to follow the pillars that we've set up to enforce our own democracy. This is the problem with libertarian ideals as a whole. They're not designed to build anything. They are person versus person. At their core, they completely ignore the idea that we live in a society at all. There is no worldview. It is just my peripheries and what my personal experience can be. They're being sought for the sole purpose of securing a business objective. Any benefit felt by someone else as a result of these policies is purely incidental.
Between 2003 and 2010, it is estimated that $500 million was spent actively denying climate change. Through political action groups like Americans for Prosperity, that they got people to chant, climate change is bullshit, when none of those people had any idea about anything. But as of 2016, at least $25 million of that $500 million has come directly from the Kochs. Why? And this goes directly to Rad Bill's point. Because not only are they in the oil business, the type of oil they refine is the worst type of oil for the environment. They've paid billions of dollars in fines to the EPA. So it's an easy decision to bet an extra $25 million to see if they can get the fucking EPA dissolved, which coincidentally is something that every Tea Party candidate seems to have made a part of their platform.
Yeah.
In 1999, Richard Fink and a few other Koch-funded organizations, the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation, were directly involved in helping Philip Morris avoid the White House filing a federal suit against them. And last but not least, I think this is just beautifully ironic and a great way to cap this out. A ton of the information in this episode comes from discussions about Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, which I confess I haven't been able to read the whole thing. But in interviews, she reports that mysterious plagiarism allegations surfaced about her when she was publishing the book, which proves, kind of to take this whole thing full circle, that while the Kochs have gotten a bit sophisticated in their quest to dominate politics, they still aren't above a little bit of intimidation. And for the past decade, the Kochs have been continuing their quest to end democracy in the West. And in 2019, David Koch finally fucking died. Now, I always hesitate to make light of someone's death, but between his impact on the United States and the way this dude licked his lips,
oh, it was so gross.
I can't feel anything but joy that he is no longer on this planet. However, with his death, something really interesting started happening with within the American right. And this could be coincidence, but I think it's worth discussing before we close. Davy Boy kicked the bucket in June, right as the 2020 political campaigns really started ramping up. And an interesting fact about David Koch is he was quite pro-choice. At least he was kind of consistent in his belief that the government shouldn't get involved in people's choices. It seems like after David's death, Republican candidates really started being more overt in their pushing of pro-life to the forefront of their political platforms. And Christian conservatives really started to take over the party. Now, it's no secret that the Kochs didn't like Trump. They're, quote, establishment Republicans. I think that what the Kochs did with the Tea Party, though, was create these terrible astroturfing movements that charged up people that would be susceptible to conspiracy theories and terrible behavior. And then when David died, a lot of that base became Trumpers, and he riled them up even further about things that maybe the Kochs wouldn't approve of him including in the discussion. And he was also doing it in a far more violent way.
Yeah.
Cue January 6th. So I say all that to say, I don't think the Kochs created Trump or this next generation of really problematic Republican voters, and that's kind of political for me to say, but I'll say it anyway. But I think they certainly created the base that fell in love with them.
Yep.
I thought that was at least worth mentioning as we finish this episode out.
Cow to water, etc., etc.
Yeah. Trump was the udder.
Yes, that's exactly right. I think the Trump thing was, again, just a byproduct of the Kochs trying to get whatever the hell they wanted and just losing control of the plot. Anyone looking for a more complete understanding of the political ambitions of the Kochs would do well to inspect Stealth, a document commissioned by Bill Koch that is unpublished. The author of the book, Clayton Coppin, was at one point hired to document the origin story of Koch Industries, meaning two things. One, his career at this point was in the toilet. I make no money doing this podcast, and I would never do something like that for a company like Koch Industries. Thing two, Coppin had unprecedented visibility into Koch Industries, which means that when Bill commissioned this future unpublished document, Coppin had access to information that no other writers could ever dream of. As such, he was able to come to an intriguing conclusion. The core belief from which Charles Koch's entire political ideology emanates is the fact that Charles Koch wants to be able to do whatever the hell he wants. He's a spoiled brat, basically. According to Coppin, Charles was the black sheep, and he was tired of getting bossed around by others, like his dad and his dad. So, after he became one of the most powerful people in the entire world, he sought refuge from the only two forces that still posed a threat to his autonomy: regulatory bodies and the courts. So the mission was clear. Baby gets to do whatever the hell he wants. And to reach these ends, David has done whatever he could to help Charles, it would seem. And Charles has spent his life stooping to whatever new lows have been necessary to achieve his ultra-libertarian goal of being completely ungovernable. This Bond villain plan here is the one that happens after the Bond villain gets everything he wants.
Yeah. This is the ending of the Bond movie where the villain wins.
Yeah, and has to come up with a new plan. The romance in this entire scenario is gone. They've already gotten all the Bond villain shit accomplished.
Yeah, well said.
With that, let's do some crutches and wrap this baby up. Consumer harm in every way. Their whole business is consumer harm. Rich parents, they had hilariously rich parents. We couldn't find a point where a Koch ancestor didn't have rich parents. It goes back to before electricity.
Yeah.
Union suppression, they elected Scott Walker to suppress unions. Union suppression is like one of their main things. They've been doing it for like a century at this point. The Koch dynasty has.
Yes.
Tax avoidance, all of their efforts are to hide donor money, and all of those organizations are 501c3s. They're dodging something. Also, their charitable donations are being given to foundations that are fighting to rewrite the tax law, which is mind-bending. These donations, I mentioned earlier, are tax deductible, and they're being used to sway public policy on how taxes can be collected on top of that.
Oh God, it's brutal.
Yeah, child labor, this didn't really fit anywhere in our story, but Koch-affiliated lobbying groups have been fighting to dismantle anti-child labor legislation for the past few years. Their fingerprints are all over that shit.
And it's fucking working, dude.
It's working.
Like, these people are doing these astroturfing campaigns, and they're like, hey, you want 14-year-olds to be able to work. And people are like, hell yeah, I do.
Right? I feel like this is part of that you can lead the cow to water thing.
Yeah.
They want what's good for corporations, and now they're having to pitch and pivot around the racism that they've incidentally given an enormous platform to.
Yeah.
The Kochs like illegal immigration, just like the Kochs have done business with Iran and skirted American sanctions to do so. They're in it for the money.
Oh, every time.
Every time. And now they're having to reckon with the fact that their racist, like anti-immigrant stuff is preventing them from getting low-wage workers that they can pay under the table. So hire 14-year-olds.
The people who have drank the tea, not the Kool-Aid, they're like, save the children, but put them in the mines.
Save the children. We need those children to clean our chimneys.
They have tiny little hands. They're so good for reaching those small spaces.
Harassment, other than the way we felt watching David Koch lick those smackers while speaking, we didn't find any. There's a ton of evidence of sexual misconduct in their lobbying organizations, but we don't have any evidence supporting the notion that they're directly involved or complicit. We have nothing definitively that says they saw it happening and let it happen, or saying they took part in it. So frustratingly, they're not getting the full bingo card here. Yeah. E, for egregious behavior after hours, we have a whole episode on Charles and David fucking over their brothers for money and suing the shit out of each other. Again, relying on taxpayer money. Yeah, it gets it all day. These people are assholes in and out of the office.
Oh, yeah.
Slap suits. This didn't fit anywhere naturally either, but when journalists have latched on to Koch misdeeds in the past, the Kochs come the hell after them.
For sure.
It's freak shit. This can be hiring investigators to go through people's trash. For Jane Meyer, the author of our seminal source on the Kochs, it was a series of trumped-up plagiarism allegations that were set to run in right-leaning media outlets. She was able to provide written proof of her innocence and prevent the stories from running. But my God, do these guys love intimidating journalists.
Yeah, like overtly. It's not even like, well, it'd be a shame if something bad happened. They're like, if you release this, we're going to accuse you of plagiarism.
Yeah, again, they're past the Bond villain shit. They've never been good about being coy. But thanks so much for listening, everyone. Yeah. Let us know how we did. This was a lengthy one. Let us know on our subreddit if you want to hear more about my 3-man horse costume or food book TM.
Definitely ask about food book TM. That's a worthwhile conversation.
For sure. We bit off a lot here.
I think that we can say definitively, without trashing ourselves, we bit off a little more than we were prepared to chew with this series. Yep. We chewed it, I feel like.
I don't feel like we choked on that one.
We did not choke, but like we said, there's definitely stories out there that we just didn't have time to include. But again, we enjoyed the process. We love you all. Like and subscribe and all of that other jazz.
Goodbye.